Baruch Adonai Amvarach Leolam Va'ed. Baruch Adonai Amvarach Leolam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Your families can be seated.
Amen. Ba'kodesh ashlishi litzeit b'nei Israel me'eretz Mitzrayim bayam hazah ba'u midbar Sinai vayitzu mirfidim vayavohu midbar Sinai vayahanu ba'midbar vayihan sham Yisrael neged ha'ar u'Moshe Allah el ha'Elohim vayikra elav Adonai min ha'ar lemor ko tomar leveit Yaakov v'taged livnei Israel.
Atem reitem asher asiti lamitzrayim va'isa echem al kenfei nesharim va'aviechem elai ve'ata im shemoa tishmeu bikoli ushmartem et breti v'item li segula makol ha'amim ki li kol ha'aretz v'atem Tiyu li mamleket kohanim v'goy kadosh ela hadvarim asher tedaber el b'nei Yisrael.
That's probably a good idea. Thank you. Vayom Moshe vayikra leziknei ha'am vayasem lifnehem et kol hadavarim ha'ele asher tzivahu Adonai vayanu kol ha'am yaktav veyomeru kol asher diber Adonai tziva naseh v'shem Moshe et divrei ha'am el Adonai.
We invite Jen, Bruce, and Julie's families to rise once again. As they rise, as we'll share the blessing following the first Torah reading. It's page 250. I'm sorry I didn't announce that before. If you want to share in the blessings in our prayer book.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Please be seated as we invite Bruce to offer our first Devar Torah.
Okay, Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 through 8 finds the Israelites near the wilds of Sinai. Moses goes and speaks to God, and God says, I've helped you, and now I'd like to make a covenant with you. You will be my people, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, as God puts it, if you obey and faithfully follow me. Moses then proceeds to relay this message to the elders of the Israelites, and they answered in unison, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. The operative word of this passage is if you will obey me. Clearly the Israelites didn't, and soon we read that they made and began worshiping a golden calf. What went wrong? We did. Why are we shown the constant failings of our people to heed the words of Adonai? I'd argue it's honest, because we as Jews and humankind, all these years later, are still a work in progress. We want to be good and serve God, but we get distracted, nervous, stressed, and do something we shouldn't. It's a vicious cycle. But we see the Israelites ride this merry-go-round of sorts repeatedly in the 40 years they're in the desert. Another intriguing aspect of these verses is that God's covenant only works if we are willing to do God's will. So, arguably, when we defy God, we are no longer in a covenant with Adonai, making for quite an existential dilemma. Using the collective we are often eager to agree and less capable in following our promises. It can be something like promising yourself to start walking or telling your mother you'll call her when you can, but not following through. Carrying through with what we promise ourselves and others is a task in mindfulness and self-discipline. Adonai makes no promises that this covenant is one of leisure. If anything, we as Jews have the onus of responsibility to put on our own shoulders to carry out what our ancestors agreed to with God. There's no downtime. We must be ever vigilant in our commitment. Ultimately, God's covenant only has validity or value if we are willing to commit to doing God's will, not our own or society's. Also, it's something to reflect upon, to think how God needs us more than we need God. It's God states, all the earth is mine, so why involve us? What difference does it make? I don't know the answers to these questions, but I don't think it's the answers to these questions that really matter. What really matters is serving God and to be willing to do his work when there is no apparent gain in doing so.
Thank you, Bruce. We now invite Janet Mink, Candy Sartori, Susan Clements, and Linda Barr for our second Torah reading as we invite their families to rise as we once again bless the Torah, page 250, for our second Aliyah.
Baruch Hu Adonai Hamborach.
Baruch Adonai Hamborach leolam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamborach leolam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah.
Amen. Families can be seated if they'd like.
Amen. Vayedaber Elohim et kol hadvarim ha'ele lemor. Anohi Adonai Eloheka asher hotzetika me'eretz Mitzrayim mibet avadim lo yiyeh leka Elohim aharim al panai lo ta'aseh leka vesel ve'kol timuna asher bashamayim mimahal va'asher ba'aretz mitachat va'asher b'mayim mitachat la'aretz.
lo tishtakashe vahem v'lo ta'ovdem ki anoki Adonai Elohecha Elkanah poked avon avot al banim al shilishim ve'oribim l'sonai ve'osei hesed la'alafim la'ohavai u'shomrei mitzvotai lo tisa et shem Adonai Elohecha lashav ki lo yenekeh Adonai et asher yisa et shemo lashav.
Zakor et Yom HaShabbat lakadsho sheshet yamin ta'avod Dasita kol melakteka ve'yom hashvi'i Shabbat ladonai Eloheka lo ta'aseh Kol melaka ata uvimuketeka abdaka vamakta uvumeka vegerach asher bishoreka ki sheshet yamim Asa Adonai et hashamayim ve'et haaretz et hayam ve'et kol basharam vayanak bayom hashvi'i al kain benar berak Adonai et hashamay et yom hashabbat Vayikadshehu.
Kaber et aveha ve'et ameha laman yaharehun yahameha al ha'adama asher Adonai Eloheha notein lak lo tirtzak lo tinaf lo tigmo lo ta'ane varaeka et shaker lo takmod beit raeka Lo takmod eshet raheha ve'avdo ve'amato ve'sharo ve'hamaro ve'ko asher larecha.
We invite these B'nai Mitzvah who've just read from the Torah to rise as their families rise again as we share the blessing at the conclusion of this Aliyah, page 250.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata betocheinu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Please be seated as we invite Janet Mink to give our second Devar Torah.
portion of the Torah that I've read is translated as follows. God spoke all of these words. I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods over me. You shall not make for yourself any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the water beneath the earth. The Israelites' journey from the land of Egypt is a familiar one to us all. The story of Passover tells us how Moses pleads with Pharaoh to let his people go, but it's not until the 10 plagues are visited on the Egyptians, ending with the angel of death slaying all of their firstborn sons, that Pharaoh releases them. And even then, he soon has second thoughts and sends his army to capture them again. God protects the Israelites, parts the Red Sea, and vanquishes the Egyptian army, and they are finally free, we're told. But what does that mean? The Exodus is often described as the journey from slavery to freedom, but at this point in the story, I'm not at all sure that the Israelites were yet able to understand the concept of freedom. Certainly, they were no longer under the control of the harsh Egyptian overseers. But who were they? A formerly enslaved people wandering under the hot desert sun to an unknown destination. It's possible that up to now their dominant goal in life was simply to survive and to take care of their own family. What values did they share? What sense of community did they have? And to use 21st century jargon, what did they identify as? Jews or former slaves? As I read and reread my Torah portion, I asked myself why God chose this moment at the start of the Exodus to lay down the laws. You shall not kill. You shall not covet your neighbor's property. You shall honor your mother and father. You shall remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. God provided a series of directives that would allow the Israelites to create a civilized society that recognizes the basic humanity of each member. Why was it important to provide an ethical framework for the people that God has chosen as God's own? Perhaps God was preparing them for the responsibility that would come with the freedom they would eventually achieve to care for and respect each other, to create customs and rituals that would bind them together as a people. The Exodus may have been an actual journey from the land of Egypt, Mitzrayim, to the Promised Land, but we can also regard it as an evolving spiritual journey, a gradual awakening, a movement from the darkness of slavery, guided henceforth by a set of rules and expectations that would form the basis of a new society and ultimately the Jewish people. The traditional interpretation of the 10 Commandments is that God is speaking to all of the Israelites as a group gathered at the foot of Mount Sinai. But if you look closely at the Hebrew text, you will notice that all of the Hebrew verbs are in second person singular, not second person plural, which is what you would normally use to talk to a group. Why is this important? Because if we consider that God is using second person singular verbs to speak to the Israelites, then it becomes clear that God is speaking directly to each person gathered there as an individual. No society can exist without each member accepting the rules and mores that govern it. The movement from slavery to freedom to becoming a people, not just a random group of former slaves, begins at this moment, at the foot of Mount Sinai, when God requires each of them to commit themselves to the personal responsibility of keeping God's laws.
Thank you, Janet. We'll all rise now as we switch our Torahs, as we return one Torah to the Ark, and we bring out our second scroll so we can be prepared for the book of Numbers. So. Having completed one story, we say the words hazak, hazak, v'nit hazak. So we'll say it 3 times. Please repeat. Say it with me. We'll say 3 times these words, reminding us that we are strengthened every time we complete a story in our Torah. Hazak, hazak, v'nit hazak. Hazak, hazak, v'nit hazak. Hazak, hazak, v'nit hazak. You can be seated. For our third and final Torah reading, we invite Sandy Letterman and Sandy Moses, as well as their families, to rise at this moment as we once again share the blessing over Torah on page 250.
Baruch Hu Adonai Hambarach.
Baruch Adonai Hambarach le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hambarach le'olam va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Your families can be seated.
Amen. Uvayom habikurim bahak rivachem mincha chadasha ladonai b'shavuotechem mikra kodesh yeh lachem Kol malachet avodah lo ta'asu v'hikravtem olah l'reach nihoach ladonai parim b'nei vakar shenayim a'il echad shiva Kevasim b'nei shana umin katam solet belula vashamin shelosha esronim lapar ha'echad shenei esronim la'ayil ha'echad.
Isaron, Isaron, lekeves ha'echad, leshivat hakvasim, seir izim echad, lechaper aleichem, milvad olat ta'amid uminchato ta'asu tamimim yiyu lachem v'nizkehem.
We invite once again your families to stand as we bless the Torah for the closing of this final Torah reading.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah tamet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Please be seated for our final Devar Torah of this evening. We invite Julie Zimmerman to share her words with us.
So the Torah portion, wait a minute, up. There we go. The Torah portion you just heard is Numbers 28 verses, yes ma'am, 26 to 31. This Torah portion describes the sacrifices that to be presented on Shavuot. The sacrifices commanded for this day are 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 yearling lambs, with meal offerings that total 1.5 ephah of meal mixed with oil, 5 hins of wine, and a goat for a sin offering to make expiation of your sins. All right, now every day there were some daily offerings also, so let's add in the daily offerings. And in measurements we all understand, it totals 2 bulls, 1 ram, 9 lambs, 1 goat, 1.7 bushels of flour, that's about 75 pounds of flour, mixed with 6.5 gallons of oil and 8.25 gallons of wine. That's a lot of stuff. A lot of noisy animals, a lot of oil and wine and flour. The animals are to be without blemish. The flour is choice flour, and the oil is beaten oil. So very specific. We don't do burnt offerings anymore. So how do we follow this commandment? Because this is a commandment. The rabbis teach that since the destruction of the temple, prayer has replaced sacrifices and burnt offerings. If all those physical offerings were commanded to be animals without blemish and choice flour and beaten oil, then how can we replace those offerings with prayers? Simply, when we pray, we must be as perfectly involved as we can be. We must be fully engaged in the prayers. We must be mindful, as Bruce told us earlier. Even if we cannot read the prayers perfectly, or if we choose to, or we need to, say other words, we must be present and mindful. Fortunately, as we have heard, our prayer book gives us time to step back from the world and refocus our energies on the prayers at hand. Why do we need to sacrifice or to pray? Remember the first words of Torah we heard tonight. The people of Israel saw what Adonai did for them in releasing them from captivity. If the people of Israel follow Adonai's commandments, they will be my treasured possession among the people. Now, we can debate about chosenness, but doesn't prayer boil down to simple gratitude? Since Adonai did and does many miracles for us, we should say thank you by following the commandments and praying sincerely. Prayer has replaced sacrifice. Let our prayers be sincere and mindful and without blemish. Shabbat Shalom.
There is another major difference between a 13-year-old having her bat mitzvah or his bar mitzvah and a non-13-year-old having their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. And that is that when we stand with our children before the ark and we pass the Torah to them, we bless them for their future. We wish upon them a successful adulthood. We wish upon them the love of life and Judaism and Torah and the embrace of a community. When you are not a 13-year-old having a bar or bat mitzvah, What we know is you have already shown that love. You have already perhaps raised children of your own. As we look at these B'nai Mitzvah before us, we have a mother and grandmother with her daughter-in-law. We have people who've raised their own children. We have people who chose Judaism at some point along their journey who never had a bar bat mitzvah when they were 13 because they didn't know they were Jewish yet. We have people who've sung in our choir, who've led our congregation on our board. We have people who have already proven themselves to be wonderful, engaged, responsible Jewish adults. And so what we celebrate this evening is not just the beginning of a new chapter, but the fact that you have already blessed us so many times with your leadership. You have been adulting for a long time. And so it's an honor. And we ask that everybody rise now as we share in the words of Shakianu, words that ask us to give thanks that you all have brought us to this moment, for all the moments that we have ahead, but especially for all the moments of leadership, of commitment, of responsibility, all the moments of Torah that you have already brought us before you shared these words tonight. We share the words of Shakianu.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shehachianu, v'kiyamanu, v'higianu, lazman hazeh. Amen.
Please be seated with our Torah.